Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today we'll be doing the oil change on my B9 A4 Allroad. I apologize for the lighting conditions in advance. It's actually a really cloudy day, and for some reason my automatic garage lighting isn't tripping. I think the light threshold isn't low enough. So yeah, as I mentioned, oil change on the B9 A4 Allroad. This is obviously the 2-liter 4-cylinder TFSI engine, the only one that's available here in the US. I'm not sure if folks had a chance to look at my RS3 oil change. Much unlike the RS3 oil change, which was a major pain in the ass, not just because the filter is at an awkward location underneath the engine, but also because it was the very first time that I was doing an oil change, and it was a learning process for me as well. Unlike the RS3, however, on the A4 as well as the S4, in fact, I'll be doing an oil change right after this. I don't know if you can see it back there. On both these cars, the oil change process is super straightforward and super simple. In fact, if you guys have never done an oil change on a car before, these are great cars to get started on. As I mentioned, super straightforward, super simple. Before we get started with the actual oil change process, let's make sure that we have all the right tools and equipment. So for one, again, an oil extractor makes your job infinitely easier. This is the same oil extractor I used for the RS3 video. It's absolutely on its last leg, so this will very likely be the very last oil change I do with this particular oil extractor. You need the oil filter, obviously, with the O-ring. I use the MAN filters. These are the OEM filters. This specific one is the HU6002Z. So yeah, this is important, obviously. You need the right oil. So in this case, actually this is the very first time I'm using the CASTROL Edge 0W40. Euro formula, actually it says right here, I'm not sure if you can see it, there you go, the European formula. And per the specs I read online, as well as what's written on the back of the bottle, it says it complies with VW 50200 50500. Obviously 502 is the gasoline spec, 505 is the diesel spec. If you look at the little sticker right here by the front of the engine, you can actually very clearly see that VW says you need to use 504 or 502 spec. So we are good to go on the oil. And again, as I mentioned, this is the very first time I'm actually using this oil, mostly because for whatever reason I couldn't locate the typical Mobil 1 Euro Formula 0W40 that I use all the time. Plus I just wanted to try out something different. So yeah, anyway, the oil filter, the oil extractor, gloves, some spare cloth, some paper towel, and obviously the wrench. I'm using a torque wrench specifically because I'll show you this later. The oil filter cap has a torque rating on it. So hey, just stick with the spec. It's not required, but you know, it's nice to again stick with the spec. In terms of the socket used, for this particular car, you need to use a 32mm socket. So yeah, that's about it. With that, let's get started with the actual oil change. Now note, before you get started with the actual oil change, it's a no-brainer for those of you who have already done this before, but for those of you who have not, as I mentioned, you absolutely need to make sure that the engine oil is warm. It doesn't need to be hot. In fact, it should not be hot. It needs to be warm though. I'll try and insert a little video at the bottom right corner to show you how to make sure that the oil is at the right temperature. So you can do this one of two ways. One is just once the engine has warmed up, just drive it around the block for maybe a couple of times, and that should get the oil warm enough. Or if you're lazy like me, just let it sit in the garage for about 5-10 minutes or so, and that will be sufficient to warm the engine up. Once you've done that, obviously turn off the engine, and remember when you're working with all of these components that the engine will be hot, which is why, as I recommend, make use of gloves. The first thing that you obviously need to do is get rid of the plastic engine cover. I've already loosened it for the sake of this video, but then for those of you who are doing it live, you need to apply some force, upward force, to get this guy out. So don't be shy in applying some force and yanking this part out. Just remember that the force that you need to apply should be upwards, not towards you. So with that, you can keep this aside. So there you go, the mighty 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine in all its glory. So this is obviously where you fill in the oil, and again, as I mentioned, the location of the oil filter housing is super convenient on this engine. It's right up here. Believe me, when you compare it to the RS3 and some of the other Volkswagen engines that I've had to work on, this is super awesome. This is as easy as it gets. And again, as I mentioned, there is a very clear torque rating mentioned on the oil filter housing cap, 25.5 nanometer, Newton meter, sorry, not nanometer, mixing fields over there. So I have set my torque wrench to about the same rating. It's a little bit less because I don't have a digital torque wrench. But yeah, so again, fairly straightforward. And let's get started with the next step. As is normally the case, figure out the dipstick tube. So in this particular car, at least in North American markets, the dipstick tube is present, but the actual dipstick is not present. It's right next to the filter housing. Instead, you just have a little cap covering the dipstick tube. This is not new, by the way. Even my 2011, 2012 B8 generation S4 did not come with the dipstick by default. I actually ended up ordering the European market dipstick for that car, but over the course of maintaining and running that car for what, 7 years now, 7+ years now, I began to realize that the onboard oil filter, the digital oil filter, actually does a half decent job of measuring and showing you the oil level. So I didn't bother getting an actual dipstick for this car. But anyway, so here is where you put in the oil extractor tube. There you go. Again, as I mentioned, please make sure that the engine is warm. It should not be hot because that will obviously take a toll on all these plastic tubing. But having a warm engine goes a long way in making your oil extraction effortless, and actually it takes a lot less time, almost half the time. So yes. So I'm not sure if you guys can actually hear that sound. So that's the sound that you want to hear towards the tail end of the oil extraction. That means that a good chunk of the oil is actually gotten out. And at least for this particular oil extractor, each ring essentially represents approximately a quart. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5-ish quarts. This is supposed to have about between 5 and 5.5 quarts. So about a quart or so remaining. I'll reinsert the extractor tube and try again to get at least about 5 odd quarts, and the remaining usually means it's a combination of either it's burnt out or there'll be some sitting in the filter housing. Alright, after having managed to pull out about a little over 5 quarts or so, we go ahead and loosen the oil filter housing. So I've already loosened this. It's with the wrench. Obviously you can't just hand twist it out, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So once you've done that, again remember that there will be some oil still left over here. You can actually see a little bit maybe potentially oozing out by the sides. So what I'm going to do right now is have some paper towel right around it so that the rest of the engine doesn't get messy. But once you've loosened it, let it sit on the actual housing for a couple of seconds so that whatever vacuum was created is now released and some of the oil can actually drip into the housing. As I mentioned, when I pulled out the oil filter cartridge, I let it sit there for a good 30-40 seconds or so, and sure enough, not a whole lot of oil, but there was some oil sitting in there. So I put in the oil extractor tube, and I am a little bit over the 5 quart mark right now. So yeah, so make sure you do that. Again, patience is the key here, otherwise this entire project can get real messy real quick. So what I have here is the oil filter housing. So a couple of things over here to notice. Obviously you have the oil filter right jutting out over there, which is again very obvious. Then much more importantly though, I don't know if you can see this very clearly in the video, but I'll try to zoom in. So this is the O-ring, right? What you need to do is this. I'm sure if I can turn this around, you'll likely end up seeing, oh, interesting. So this particular one doesn't have a tab. Some of the MAN O-ring filters tend to have a tab. that you can use to then use your nose plier to then pull out. But either way, so the point is you need to make sure that when you replace the actual oil filter itself, you also need to absolutely replace the O-ring, right? And there will be a replacement O-ring with your new oil filter. But again, please make sure you do this. Alright, so something interesting happened. Just for giggles, after obviously putting in the extractor tube into the oil filter housing and removing the filter, and again, some small amount of oil came out of this. I actually put the tube back into the dipstick tube and pumped the oil extractor again, and lo and behold, some more oil came out, right? So again, so with the evacuator tube or the oil extractor method, you want to make sure that after every process or every step, you reinsert the tube to make sure that there isn't a whole lot left. Now I'm actually pretty satisfied because I actually have just exactly over the 5 quart mark. And again, as I mentioned, don't expect, especially if you use the car for a lot of stop and go traffic, daily commuting and whatnot, depending on your usage, don't expect the exact amount of oil to come out. There will be some oil usage, obviously. That's just the nature of things, especially with these direct injected newer turbocharged engines. Alright, so here is the old oil filter removed with the old O-ring. Again, as I mentioned, that is something that typically you have to pull out using the nose plier. Again, for the third time, I reiterate, make sure you replace that. It is absolutely essential you do that. Here is the new oil filter cartridge. Again, it's the HU6002Z. And as I mentioned, the new oil filter cartridge will always come with an O-ring. Depending upon which version of the cartridge that you're using for which car, sometimes there may be an extra ring. I usually see that with the filter that I use for the S4. To date, I haven't figured out where to use that extra ring, because even when the car came from the factory or from the dealer, there's just one O-ring. But in this case, it's simple. It's just one O-ring. Now, the important step that I always follow, and I recommend others follow too, for the sake of completeness at least, is that when you install this new O-ring, make sure you lathe it in a little bit of fresh oil so that the seal is complete. Again, it's not a required step, but it is something that I have always followed, and I highly recommend that others follow too, just for the sake of completeness. Alright, it's now time for me to put in the fresh oil. Now, I'm not sure if you guys can actually see this. Actually, let me see if I can zoom in. There you go. There's a little plastic flap or a piece over there, so to speak, because of which you won't be able to get in your funnel all the way in. It's super shallow. It'll just about rest on top of the oil filter cap. So make sure that when you're putting in the fresh oil, you don't put in a whole lot, because it's entirely possible that some of it may spill over there, depending upon how much oil you actually put in. So put it in stages, put in little by little so that you don't have any spills, because cleaning up spills over here can be a bit of a pain in the rear end. It'll just spill all over. And again, as you can see over here, make sure that you put in adequate pieces of cloth, or keep paper towel accessible, so that in case of a spill, you can respond quickly and not have it be too big of a mess. Alright, so that's about 5 quarts in. Again, as I mentioned, the capacity is somewhere between 5 and 5.5 quarts. I have another 1 quart jug that I'll put in over there. I won't put the entire amount. Again, I don't even put 5.5. I always make sure to put somewhere between 5 and 5.5 quarts. What I tend to do though is at least towards the tail end of the big jug, I don't let all of it go in through the oil filter cap housing. I always make sure that at least a couple of capfuls towards the tail end, I have it sit on top of the oil filter housing over there, because you don't want oil starvation. It's not that big a deal, frankly speaking, but then again, similar to how I make sure to lube the O-ring and have a little bit of oil in the new filter, I also make sure to put a little bit of oil through the oil filter housing, just for the sake of completeness. Alright, with about 5.2, 5.3 odd quarts of oil put in, everything good to go. Make sure that you obviously replace the oil cap, the dipstick tube cap, as well as the oil filter, obviously. So in case of the oil filter, again, it should, if you put the oil o-ring correctly, it should actually just screw in very, very easily by hand. I tend to do it by hand until it actually develops some resistance. I'm not sure if you guys can hear. There you go. So I make sure I screw it in until I get some solid resistance. There you go. I can't screw it in anyway. And then I end up using the torque wrench to set it to the final torque rating of 25.5 Newton meter. And obviously, after everything is done, make sure you clean everything up and replace the engine cover on top. Alright, after making sure that you have double and triple checked that you have replaced everything back the way it is supposed to be, and put in about, as I said, between 5 and 5.5 quarts of oil, make sure you start the engine. Once you start the engine, go into your MMI interface, go into vehicle, then go into service and checks, go into the oil level menu, and here this is exactly what you'll see. In that it's letting you know that it actually takes a little bit of time. In this case it says 2 minutes. It's not always exactly 2 minutes. The engine needs to be warm, again, as I mentioned, and switched off. So what I typically tend to do is I have my S4 parked behind this car right now, but typically and let it warm up a teeny tiny bit. I tend to take it around the block a couple of times, come back, park the car in the exact same location, turn off the engine, wait about a minute or so, and then go into this exact same menu screen again, and you will see a little oil level, like a meter of sorts with a min max. And hopefully, if you followed all these steps correctly, your engine oil level should be at or near the max level. If it's near the max level, obviously go in, put in a little bit more. Again, as I mentioned, I don't start with the full 5.5 quarts. I always fill in about 5.2, 5.3 ish. I've never had an issue with the engine not displaying max or having much of a problem between oil changes. But again, as I said, if you see it's a little less than max, go in, put in a little bit more, drive it around again and try it again and make sure the level looks good. But yeah, again, as I mentioned, fairly straightforward with this generation of cars. Hopefully you guys also have an equally easy oil change experience on your B9 A4 Allroad. If you have any questions, as usual, make sure to leave them in the comment sections below. Again, if you find these videos useful, please make sure to subscribe them and pass around the word, so that others who have same cars or similar cars also find these tutorials and videos to be just as helpful. Thanks a bunch, guys.